Welcome everyone and good evening. My name is Professor Catherine Gelber, the Acting Head of School of the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland, and we're hosting this event this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and meet and pay our respects to elders past and present. It's my honour to commence this evening by introducing Auntie Kerry Charlton, which will happen in a moment, who is with us in an official capacity to welcome us to country. I'd also like to welcome the Honourable Linda Burney MP, Shadow Minister for Human Services and Member for Barton, Professor Peter Hoy, the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Queensland, members of the University Senate and the University Senior Management Group, UQ colleagues, distinguished guests, students, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our annual lecture. The School of Political Science and International Studies is very pleased to host this lecture every year. Indeed, it's a highlight on our calendar of events. In the past, we've been lucky enough to welcome the Honourable Anna Bligh, the first female Premier of Queensland, the Honourable George Brandis, Federal Senator and Attorney General of Australia, Senator the Honourable Robert Hill AC, and Ms Lyndall Sachs, former diplomat. We continue this venerable tradition this evening with a lecture by the Honourable Linda Burney MP on the topic of reconciliation, referendum and agreement making. And in a moment she'll be officially introduced by the Vice-Chancellor. Just before that, I'd like to say how pleased we are that the Honourable Linda Burney agreed to give our annual lecture this evening. The topic is of immense importance to Australian politics and society and is one that we have collectively so far failed to address adequately. Earlier this year, around 300 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples gathered at Uluru to hold a First Nations convention. This was held following extensive regional dialogues with Indigenous people around the question of Indigenous constitutional recognition. We need to listen to Indigenous people's voices in this debate. This evening we're privileged to hear from the first Indigenous woman to be elected to the Australian House of Representatives, 116 years after our Parliament first met. Our next guest is Mr Shane Drum, Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Engagement at the University of Queensland, and he will introduce the speaker this evening who will do a welcome to country. Please welcome Mr Shane Drum.
Thank you, Professor Gelber. I'd also like to welcome everyone here tonight and personally thank you all for attending what is no doubt going to be a fantastic address by the Honourable Linda Burney. I'd also like to acknowledge what a great turnout it is and I look forward to catching up with you all afterwards for a bit of a chat and a quiet drink. I've been given the pleasure to introduce Auntie Kerry Charlton. Auntie Kerry is part of the Gurrumpul Yuggera people and she's also on the co-chair of UQ's RAP Steering Committee with Professor Peter Hoy. I'd like to ask Auntie Kerry to do a welcome and welcome us to the land in which we're gathering tonight, which is obviously a traditional custom of Aboriginal people. So, Auntie Kerry, if you can please welcome everyone here tonight. Thank you.
Yawa, Yuangan. Friendly greetings. Good evening. I'd like to acknowledge the Honourable Linda Burney as well, and my co-chair with the our RAP Steering Committee, and everybody, all of our VIPs here. And I usually go by the name Garja Kerry because I've been doing a lot of work on language revitalisation, and Garja is one of our terms for somebody who's got eldership characteristics. But I'm happy if people call me Auntie. I've always, we always call each other aunties and uncles, and I can't wait till the day I call Shane uncle. But mostly I'd like to say it's a privilege to be able to do Welcome to Country here this evening. And any time I do it, I feel blessed and honoured because it's honouring those who've gone before us and it's honouring our traditions and it's also, you know, our old people used to say the more that we talk our way and sing our way and talk our lingo on country, we are healing our land, healing the heart and soul of our land. And so it's always a privilege. So I've been involved for a long time in reconciliation and healing, in community development and education and other things. And I do very much enjoy doing Welcome to Countries. And I'm a Gurunpul person, one of the groups of Yagara people. My great-grandfather was a Yagara man. From his area was Oxley through to the mouth of the Brisbane River and over to Stradbroke Island. So we're one of the groups of Quandamooka. And he married a lovely West Yagara woman who was born in the bush outside Laidley. And so we also have descent there, and that people's group is called the Mudjibara. So I'd like to acknowledge my old people. They were probably the generation before them was the generation that lived their life out free, and my great-grandparents, they were the ones who were the first generation incarcerated for the next 60 years in the mission system, particularly around Deebing Creek and Cherbourg, Baramba Cherbourg. And they did quite a lot to stay strong with other traditional people from the area. So because of that, I want to acknowledge our traditional neighbours, Cubby Cubby people and the Waka Waka people and the Yugambeh people, along with the Yagara people. So I'm not talking about tribes, I'm talking about the countries, the language groups and the countries. When we do Welcome to Country, I like to have a little formula so I don't, get lost in the middle of trying to speak my welcome. And what I've come up with is that we have 4 parts. Our acknowledgements, our explanation, our introduction and our blessing. So it's halfway through the vowels, just over halfway, so it helps me to keep it there. And so I've introduced myself, I've acknowledged. My Guri ties are the Gurunpul with Yagara and Quandamooka, also the Nyungda people of Cubby Cubby, which is north. But also I acknowledge my great-grandmother who was brought down from the Gulf country, and she was a Wollongama woman. And I'm very pleased to say Wollongama shows up on the Tyndale map, the big map with all the colours denoting countries, as she was one of the few survivors of what had happened around the northern part of that country. In our kinship system, we are Dandraban people. Dandra means ironbark. And in our kinship structures, we follow our father's tribal group, language group, and we belong to our father's country. But we also have that dual citizenship, which I hope is not a dirty word, but couldn't help that. But because we follow the totem of our mother, and so we have laws and obligations, and so we have obligations and responsibilities with both countries. So when we call ourselves Guri, and my old people taught us to call ourselves Guri. And I don't know what happened, but further south it goes into Kuri. So, because it gets a bit colder or something, but getting down that way. But Anyway, we were taught Guri, and I know they do in Bundjalung as well. And we are strong Guris, and because I said a joke, I lost my way. But so the Dandraban is our subgroup within our tribe, and we had 4 subgroups, and within each of those groups were the totem system. And so we could marry across into another subgroup. It was usually the flora and the trees and the flowers. So we were always named for a feature of it. So my great granny was named Maminda, and that denoted her subgroup. It meant native daisy. But she belonged to the flower of the honeysuckle tree, and she belonged to that flora. And so our totems then had the meat in them and the birds. So our totem is carpet snake. And so we have laws with that. So every step of the way there's laws and there's protocols and there's structure. And I like to just explain that because it helps us understand what we are re-establishing and what we are revitalising, and how far, we have to come back with recovering from our histories, and also to celebrate where we've got to. And my family also were friends with some of the early frontier families, with the Petries and others. So they had contracts and agreements with them for decades at different times. And so they all worked together trying to come through a bit of a mishmash there. So I just wanted to talk about that and introduce that and leave it there. And because I think it leads in a little bit too, because without each other, without structures and without laws to help us, we can't really have reconciliation. So I'd like to say a welcome blessing upon tonight. Nari ba bing, unyo wan ganchiba, ni ba ni marumba. Our Most High Creator, bless us and protect us. Nuru nya dagubayan ma marugunya yagarajara. Touch our hearts, be with us as we talk and walk and work on Yagara country. Be bulka, welcome, welcome, be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carey, for continuing to educate myself and others in this room. It's wonderful to have you. I too wish to acknowledge the owners of the traditional land upon which we gather and meet, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Of course, I want to acknowledge the Honourable Linda Burney MP, Shadow Minister for Human Services and Member for Barton. Linda was here in a different capacity 2.5–3 years ago before she transferred from the New South Wales Parliament into the Federal Parliament, where we had the very striking Courting Blackness exhibition, which was a great thing, and it was great that you could come then too. So we appreciate how busy you are. You know, I'm a Johnny-come-lately. I arrived in Australia in 1987, so compared to 65,000 years, I was very late. Many of you will know that this university established that Aboriginal people had been here for at least 65,000 years just a month ago, which was a wonderful thing to establish. When I got here in 1987, many Australians were excited about the impending 200th anniversary of the arrival of the first convicts. But it did become obvious quite quickly to me that not everyone felt it was a time to celebrate. A few months after I arrived, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody got underway, and throughout 1988 there were ongoing questions about the appropriateness of celebrating a year that for some signified the start of dispossession. I heard a Prime Minister say he wanted to work towards a treaty with the First Nations people. Then I heard another Prime Minister give a speech in Redfern Park. I thought it was a very good one. A song-called treaty made it to number 11 on the charts, and the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation was created by an Act of Parliament with bipartisan support. All this happened in my first 4 years in Australia. At that time, there seemed to be a momentum. The word reconciliation was on the lips of many Australians. However, as debates have ebbed and flowed for the past quarter of a century, with milestones, including the Mabo judgment and the Prime Ministerial apology for the stolen generations, the word reconciliation seems to have meant different things to different people. Tonight we will hear deeper insights about those words, and more from a woman who has not had the luxury of observing from a safe distance, a luxury that I've had. The Honourable Linda Burney MP, who is a proud member of the Wiradjuri Nation, was barely 10 years old when the 1967 referendum received a record yes vote for the Australian government to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. 11 years later, she graduated with a diploma of teaching from the college that is now Charles Sturt University. She was its first Aboriginal graduate. Her early career involved teaching in a Western Sydney public school and working as an education bureaucrat. She served on the aforementioned Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation from 1994 to 1996 and on many other boards and committees. In 1998, Ms. Burney was appointed Deputy Director General of the New South Wales Department of Aboriginal Affairs, later becoming Director General. In 2003, she was the first Aboriginal Australian to be elected to the New South Wales Parliament, where she held a number of senior ministerial portfolios and was for a time Deputy Opposition Leader. And Linda says to me, it's much nicer to be in government than in opposition. In July last year, Ms. Burney became the first Aboriginal woman elected to the House of Representatives of the Parliament of Australia. She immediately was made Shadow Minister for Human Services. Friends, please join me in welcoming the Honourable Linda Burney MP to deliver the 2017 Lecture in Political Science and International Studies on Reconciliations, Referendum and Agreement Making. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. How are you? You good? That's good. Can I firstly say how blessed we are, Garja, Kerry, Aunt Kerry, for your extraordinary welcome to country. And also the sharing that you have given us about an insight into how our culture works, and an insight that most Australians would have very little understanding of. So for us to hear about the way in which structures take place and our mutual responsibility to nature and how that's established is a very, very special thing to hear. And also a little of your family story. You are certainly a Queensland girl through and through. So thank you very much for that. Can I join with you in that acknowledgement? And in saying that, reminding us all of the importance of the great truth of this nation, that our maps that we know recently are not the only maps of Australia. As Kerry has very eloquently described to you her family connections, it is clear that there are many maps of this country, and there are the most ancient maps, the maps of sovereign nation states. In that context, can I recognise the Gurubal Yagara people and join with everyone else that's recognised country. You know, you've probably heard a recognition or a welcome to country many, many times. And it is something that is not a new tradition in this country. It's not new. It is generations upon generations old. We have managed to bring that fine tradition back. And the beauty of that tradition is that it embraces all of us in this lecture theatre, in this city, in this state, and across the country. And thank you for reminding us of that. When we travel across our continent, we do travel through hundreds of individual sovereign nation states, each with our own law, customs, histories, and language. And that is one of the most extraordinary things about this very, very big country. As Peter introduced me, my country is Wiradjuri country. And if you think, well, where's Wiradjuri country? If you imagine the middle of New South Wales, which is about Dubbo, and you imagine you're standing looking towards Tasmania or Victoria, and you make a fan shape out, you get an idea of Wiradjuri territory. It's a very large nation. And the three rivers that embrace or run through Wiradjuri country is the Lachlan, the Macquarie, and the Murrumbidgee. And I am of the Murrumbidgee Wiradjuri. And I have, as part of my story, which is not an unusual story for First Peoples, I did not know I was Wiradjuri, although I'd grown up in Wiradjuri territory, and then subsequently found out I'd studied in Wiradjuri country in Bathurst, and that was because I did not meet my father or my 10 brothers and sisters until I was 27, 28 years old. A remarkable experience, but unfortunately not an unusual one for our people. I know I was not one of the taken children, but I could very well easily have been, and a little bit more about that in a while. In my inaugural speech in the Federal Parliament, I opened with some words from my language, and these were the words, and I'd like to share them with you tonight because I think they're very pertinent to you and this lecture. And the words were in Wiradjuri. Was Balam Ambul Nanawul Narambi Yanyamara, Nyaju Bang Marang, Nyaju Nyaha Yawangha, Naha Balang Nang Dadang, Naju Biap Yanga Baring Angal, Nagu Yan Yanyam, Gedyal Yanyamara Madang Narangija. And what that says is, I have just said in my language, I pay respect to the ancient Ngunnawal and Narambi, which were the traditional owners of the Canberra area. If I was saying it here tonight, I'd say Gurubal Yagra. I say this good day, I'm giving my speech tonight, and I am deeply moved. I have journeyed to another place. I am one person. I wish in this place to honour, to be respectful, to be gentle, and to be polite. I am thankful and happy. I could weep. And they were the words that I opened my first speech in the Federal Parliament, and I opened my speech here tonight to you with those words. So in that context, I pay very deep respect to Gajah Kerry's country. Can I also acknowledge Professor Peter Hoy, who has just told me a little bit of his story. Thank you, Peter. To Professor Julie Duck, to Catherine Gelber, thank you, Professor. To Shane, thank you very much for making us welcome in your place. And also, of course, Kerry and the senior management group of the university. But I'd also like to thank, most importantly, the University of Queensland and the Political Science and International Studies School for this kind and generous invitation. And I am very in awe of the past speakers. You know, they all say honourable this, so I don't know how honourable I am. But anyway, I've got the title, I'm going to hold on to it. I can tell you how you get it if you're interested, but that would probably take up too much time. It doesn't always mean you'd be terribly honourable, always, but anyway. Can I just say that I am very in awe of being in the wake of Gareth Evans, Lyndall Sachs, Robert Hill, George Brandis, Anna Bligh and Kevin Rudd. And I'd like to just share with you a story that is associated with one of those people. And of course it's a Queenslander, Kay Rudd. And I will never forget this day. It was probably one of the most astounding days of my life. And I am sure that each and every one of you in this room could tell me exactly what you were doing and where you were on the 12th of February in 2008. Of course, that was the opening, the first day of the new parliament. Rudd and the Labor Party had just won the election, and the very first act was the apology to the stolen generations. And it was a remarkable day, and it fits very much into what our topic is about tonight. The reason it was so remarkable, for me anyway, is it felt like we as a country could finally exhale. There was an exhaling of breath when we heard those three simple words from the Prime Minister: "We are sorry." And you'll remember what happened. I was so lucky to be in the gallery overlooking the Parliament that day. And sitting around the edge of the Parliament, on the floor of the Parliament, were old people. There were actually children that were taken. And I have never seen such generosity in my whole life, and it has affected me in a very profound way on how I conduct myself these days. Around that room were old men and women who, as babies, as young children, they were taken. Who knows what their stories all were. But at the end of those apologies, Kevin Rudd, Jenny Macklin, who was the minister, I'm struggling, head of the, he was the leader of the opposition then, he's now head of the, Brendan Nelson, whom I like very much, and one other person walked around shaking the hands of those old people. Amazing. And one of the old women who represented that group stood up with a couple of other old women and handed to the Prime Minister a coolamon. And of course, that's what we carried our babies in. And I thought, if you can stand up and do that, how is it that we can't be full of generosity and kindness? And that really did have a most remarkable effect on me. After the apology, we all walked out onto the forecourt of the Parliament, where the Fire Dreaming mural is. And I remember running into Auntie May Robertson. She was a woman that I'd known for many, many years. And she was carrying a black and white photograph about this big of a little girl with a big bow in her hair. And she fell into my arms crying, and I fell into her arms crying. And she said, "Linda, I brought Mummy with me today." It was just incredible, absolutely incredible. So, as Peter says, this is a year of anniversaries. 50 years since the 67 referendum, 25 years since Mabo, and 20 years since the Bringing Them Home report. Remarkable, remarkable things that have happened in our nation. The 1967 referendum was a historic moment for Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, that for the first time, we, Indigenous people, were included as part of the Australian population. Amazing. And that inclusion really had a profound effect on this country, but it was also personal to so many of us. Some of you may have memories of that time. Some of you may have voted, I don't think so, in that referendum, but perhaps. But you certainly have parents and grandparents who just 50 years ago cast that historic vote. In the over 200 years of injustice perpetrated against First Australians, of dispossession, of death, of removal of children from families, of destruction of culture, and as Kerry has said, language, the 67 referendum marked a major step towards the long road towards reconciliation. It was a great change. And it was not just about that 98%. Think of what was happening in Australia in the 60s for our people. Gardja Kerry spoke about her family and what was taking place there. But just 1 year before the 67 referendum, we had the extraordinary bravery of Vincent Lingiari and his people walking off Wave Hill, saying to one of the biggest, most powerful companies, pastoralists in the world, we're not going to live like dogs anymore. We want fair pay. And that led to the really birth of modern land rights, because it was really about that country. And they sat out for 8 years. And that wonderful song of Kev Carmody and Paul Kelly, From Little Things, Big Things Grow, tells that story. So that was the year before the 67 referendum. In 1965, we had those remarkable freedom rides of Sydney University students and Charles Perkins, going through Western and Northern New South Wales, pointing out that, and this is in our lifetimes, the prejudice and the injustice, where kids in Moree could not swim in the public pool, where people in Kempsey and Taree had to sit in front of the roped-off section in cinemas, where Aboriginal returned servicemen in Walgett could not go to the RSL club. And one of the things that really strikes me from that time, thinking about where we've gotten to now in 67, getting to 67, was in the town of Walgett. I remember an old lady telling me the story, she's gone now, that when she got married, she was not allowed to try on her wedding dress because no one else would buy it if she didn't. Now this is the cauldron for that 67 referendum. So how is it that 98% of the Australian population voted yes? And that's the question for today, as it was the question back then. And for me, everyone, reconciliation is not a destination. I think it's really important. It's not a destination. Reconciliation is a journey. And that's the important part of reconciliation. It's how we as individuals respond, how we as a university or a community responds. So here we are 50 years after 67, and we stand at another critical juncture in the reconciliation journey, actioning the sentiments and the vision of the Referendums Council Uluru Statement from the Heart, establishing an Indigenous voice in the Parliament and a truth-telling body that would also have responsibility for agreement making. And of course, whether there are any other issues that may arise from that context. We are grappling with this, and we have to grapple with it if we as a country are going to make the next step in constitutional reform, and that is an Indigenous voice. as Peter said, or perhaps I should say the Vice Chancellor said, that in 1967 I was 10 years old. I was born in 1957, so I'm 61 next birthday. And I was born in a very small country town with the double whammy of being black and of being out of wedlock. And you will know what that means in a small country town in 1957. It was tough. For 10 years I lived my life as a young Aboriginal girl as not being worthy, like all first Australians of that time, of not being included in the census. And that's really what changed in 67. That was the change that meant something to us. For the first time, we were going to be counted. I don't remember all that clearly the referendum campaign. I lived in a house without a television, and I grew up with my great aunt and uncle, who were non-Aboriginal people, born in the late 1890s. They were in their 60s when they took me on in 57. And they were brave people, and they suffered socially for putting their hand up to raise this little black girl without a dad. That's why I didn't meet my dad till I said I'd met my dad when I was 28. And I can't tell you, and I will never know what my life would have been had it not been for those brave people. But I do know how they would have voted in 67 on the 27th of May. But I know that before I was 10, in some ways a non-citizen, or at best a second-class one. And that's really important to understand in terms of understanding Aboriginal people today. When I was at school, I was taught that Aboriginal people were an inferior race to white people. I was taught to be ashamed of my Aboriginality, and I was encouraged to hide it. I will never forget, as a 13-year-old, sitting in a social studies classroom, being taught that Aboriginal people were the closest example to Stone Age man living on earth today. Imagine what that does to a young girl trying to come to terms with who she was and where she came from. I felt like turning into a piece of paper and sliding between the cracks in the floor. Such was the times. That was well into the lifetime of yourselves, of your parents and grandparents. Along with that very deliberate constitutional discrimination, Indigenous people were the subject of a range of other discriminatory laws, and I'm sure you know this. Our freedom of movement was restricted to missions and reserves. Our access to services was almost non-existent, including many of the social service benefits that existed at that time. Our ability to access educational training was dependent on luck, not capacity. Until 1972 in New South Wales, the New South Wales Teachers' Handbook still gave principals the capacity to not allow Aboriginal children to attend public schools. And of course, the most destructive of all, our families were broken and separated, forbidden to speak our language, to love and have culture. Before all that was the dispossession, disease and slaughter of our people. And those things are important to understand, particularly for students like yourselves. I am so offended when people take the attitude, just get over it and get on with it. Intergenerational trauma is a real thing. And many of us, from many different lives and experiences, know that. The 67 referendum was significant in that it marked a moment when Aboriginal people were included in the census. It also allowed the Commonwealth to make laws in relation to Aboriginal people. But that story of what touches us is important. And it's something you might want to think about what touches you. I will always remember a few months ago driving on the back road in my country between Griffith and Narrandera. And I was driving along and I knew this story, and I had to stop the car because I couldn't drive any further when I drove over a creek called Poison Waterhole Creek. And the story came flooding back, that was the creek that my direct relatives would have been driven up, herded onto an island that's still called Murdering Island, and massacred. And those are part of our living memory and story. And they are part of every Australian's living memory and story. And that's what's important, particularly when we come to reconciliation and referendum. The referendum was both remarkable in its historical significance, but also extraordinary that the Constitution required an amendment to simply recognise Aboriginal people as part of the Australian population. A very burdensome constitutional process through which the question of affording basic human rights and equality to First Australians was to be decided by the Australian public. I was in Adelaide not long ago at the museum, and I saw some of the actual material that was used in that campaign. And what struck me about it, and what we've got to remember about it in the context of what we're going to be looking at as a nation, is how simple the message was, how succinct it was, how it caught everyone. And I'll talk about why I think it did in a moment. We can never underestimate the significance of the six, and I'm going to try and ignore the marriage equality thing that could be applied to this right now, but that's another story. In any event, we can never underestimate the significance of the 67 referendum, what it meant, and how it shaped the way this country views and values First Australians. And that's the historical significance of it. And despite the convincing result, we can never underestimate, and this is another very important thing for us to understand, we can never underestimate the work and effort that went into bringing about the favourable result. We must never forget that of the 44 referendums in Australian history, only 8 have passed successfully, and 98% is through the ballpark. And equally as important, proponents of the next referendum will need to be able to articulate that vision to Australian people. The proponents will need to build a strong and solid case. We only have to look at recent examples internationally, Clinton, Brexit and others, to know just how clear we must be in our messages. The referendum was the result of a hard-fought 10-year campaign by both non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. And that is the key, I think, to where we go. And some of those people are well known to all of us, and particularly to students in your field. People like Jessie Street and Faith Bandler, but many others. The lesson I learnt from Faith Bandler, who I knew very well, I spoke at her commemoration actually, is that she used to talk about playing the long game. And that's what this is. In Aboriginal affairs, there are no quick fixes. And in constitutional reform, it is a long game. Think about the 67 referendum. 3 prime ministers and 10 years it took. And there were not the resources that we have now. The proposed amendment text was simple and succinct, and the question was simple and succinct as well. Vote yes for Aboriginal rights, and that was the poster. And I believe that the reason it was so effective was this. Is it appealed to something really important that we Australians understand. It appealed to fairness. I mean, in 67, there was no great sympathy for Aboriginal people. There certainly wasn't the understanding that there is now. But people knew things were unfair. And I think that's why. I've had a flu, I'm sorry. I don't suppose anyone's got a lozenge. I'm serious. Because I can suck on that and talk at the same time, which I did at a lecture the other night. I think it actually appealed to the basic sense of what's fair, and I think that's why it was actually successful. So moving forward, oh God, you're deadly. They take your head off. I can't get it out. I can do two things at once. I'm a girl. I actually think that the success of the referendum, oh gosh, that's good, was actually it appealed to what Australians, one of our values, and it's that value of fairness. People knew the stakes were high, but it was that value of fairness that was appealed to. I think the other thing about the 67 referendum is that it was a campaign where people spoke to each other. It was a campaign where people went out and talked to each other. And one of the things I've learned from my involvement in reconciliation is that the most powerful form of reconciliation is bringing people together face to face. So moving forward on recent proposals from the Referendum Council and the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the prospect of success will really be contingent on two things: clarity of vision, what is it that's being proposed, and two, clarity of purpose. What will this mean for the country? And that's crucial. That's absolutely crucial in referendum change. What will it mean for the country? And of course, the alternative scenario that of failure will have grave and lasting consequences. Referendums aren't like elections. They don't come around every 3 years. If a referendum fails, you'll be lucky to see if the question ever gets asked again, let alone if it gets asked again in your lifetime. The stakes are indeed high. As the Hamilton song goes, we cannot throw away our shot. I think it's very easy to take things for granted. I have great confidence that everyone in this room tonight is reasonably across the issues, the ebbs and flows of the topics of the reconciliation and recognition. But we must remember we won't be the only ones making a decision. Proponents of the next referendum, whatever they may look like, will need to be beyond certain of what the referendum wants to achieve and how we will do that. So what is it? And I'll try and finish up so we can have a bit of a yak. So where to look for us on reconciliation today? And what did the Uluru Statement from the Heart have to say? What was the outcome of the Referendum Council's report? The Referendum Council was appointed by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. The terms of reference were set out, but the Referendum Council came back with something that we didn't expect. We as a nation, for 8 years, had been talking about the race powers and recognise Aboriginal people in the Constitution. But that's not what the Referendum Council gave us. They gave us the establishment of an Indigenous voice to the Parliament and the establishment of a truth-telling body. The Referendum Council then released its report largely echoing the sentiments from Uluru. It made two simple recommendations, and this is exactly what they said. One, the creation of a representative body for Australians that would function as an Indigenous voice to the Parliament to be enshrined in the Constitution. And two, the drafting of a declaration of recognition of First Australians as a document separate to the Constitution. It did not make any recommendations in relation, as I said, to the race powers or recognising First Peoples in the Constitution. And I think that's a dilemma. The former Howard Minister Amanda Vanstone at the time of the report's release mentioned that it's not what anyone expected. It was broad and the subject to many interpretations. But there can be no doubt that the recommendation of the Council for an Indigenous voice to the Parliament is significant and historic, and my party has embraced it. For over 200 years, the destiny and the aspirations of First Australians have not been of our own choosing. The micromanagement of virtually every aspect of our lives has been something that you're all aware of. An Indigenous voice, everyone to the Parliament, would give Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people a greater say in the issues and the decisions of government that affect our lives. And frankly, we should. As I said, my party is committed to it. But there may be many political and logistical challenges ahead. It feels like yesterday that we had just had our last federal election. Now listen to this, because I think this is going to be the challenge. Now we've got a postal plebiscite on our hands. Well, I wouldn't call it a plebiscite, but we've got a postal survey on our hands, which will dominate the latter half of this year's legislative agenda. So stay with me, because it's about timing. We could miss this. You've got the equal marriage plebiscite. That will take up the rest of this year from a legislative point of view. We've only got 4 more weeks of sitting. In 2017 and 2018, there will be state elections in Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania and Victoria. Then there will be a state election early in 2019 in New South Wales. And somewhere in there will be another federal election. So the question is, where do you fit in a standalone referendum without people getting fatigued? And that's possible. So there is a whole host of constitutional issues that are starting to face Australia. I wouldn't be surprised, depending on what the High Court says. There's some clamour to change Section 44 around citizenship. There is also the Republic that's come back up, and Bill Shorten's committed to the first phase of a question around that in the first year of a Labor government. And there is also the referendum question floating around of 4-year terms for the federal parliament. So what I'm trying to say is it's all getting pretty squeezed in, and that's really important. It may be some time before the Australian public will be receptive to another electoral exercise after all that, but we can't miss the opportunity. So just in the few pages I've got left, if you can just stay with me. The other challenge, of course, is the broad nature of the recommendations produced by the referendum councils, because there was no direction about an Indigenous voice. Now, this is where we get critical. This is where the mechanics have to kick in. We can talk about referendums as much as we want to, but in the end it has to become a political process. It's the parliament that decides on the question and the timing of a referendum. That hasn't clicked with a lot of people. So what needs to happen? What needs to happen, and the only way it can happen, is that there needs to be a joint committee of the parliament, and the most powerful committee of a parliament is a joint standing committee. But the only person that can establish that is the Prime Minister. Okay? So we have Bill Shorten has written to the Prime Minister suggesting a joint standing committee. The Prime Minister is very open to that, but he needs to get that through his caucus and through his cabinet. I won't say any more. So until we get that, the Parliament cannot take this question any further. There has to be a joint standing committee to determine the question, what it will be about, and the time frame. And we are arguing that that has to happen this year. Otherwise, we could well miss the boat in terms of the timing. And I'll just leave that with you. It's make or break. It seems to me that we're in a holding pattern at the moment on reconciliation and recognition. I have argued for years that whatever happens in terms of this referendum, Aboriginal people must be recognised in some way within the Constitution. There are many hurdles for any prospective referendum, but we need to be clear about the proponents and to be able to articulate its relevance to the Australian public, and that's the key as well. I alluded to earlier the establishing our clarity of purpose, and what this will mean to the nation. There will also be the usual suspects running a scare campaign and a no case, of course, but let's not go there at the moment. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a dilemma where I believe that there is momentum within this country to take the next step in terms of constitutional reform for First Peoples. The level of knowledge is more than ever at the moment. But until the Prime Minister moves to establish a mechanism so that the Parliament can do its job, none of this can happen. Does that make sense to people? So that's where we're basically at the moment. Can I just finish up by saying that I haven't spoken much about agreement making, and I'm very happy to talk about that in terms of the questions. And I think the point that Kerry made in relation to her grandparents and the Petries and contracts and agreement making was a magnificent one. Can I finish up by saying a few things about symbolism? Some will say that constitutional reform is purely symbolic, and it's not. Constitutional reform in 1967 led to incredible things in the 70s. It led to self-determination. It led to the establishment of Indigenous bodies. It led to many of the things that we see today, including, I would argue, things like the apology. But it just astounds me that the political class, and I guess I'm part of that, constantly says that, we want to address the practical issues in Aboriginal affairs. Well, of course we do. But that is a job of government. That should happen anyhow. Health, education, and so forth. I think symbolism is incredibly important to who we are as a nation. Yes, social justice outcomes are crucial. I'm not ignoring that. But symbolism does matter. Do our statues matter? Of course they do. Do special days matter? Do days like Australia Day, Survival Day, Anzac Day? Of course they matter. You surely can't tell me that symbols and symbolism don't matter. Symbolism reflects who we are and what we value. And why does it resonate so much? Why does a sunburnt country resonate so much? And I've got a new staff member, he's quite young, and he could not believe that I could rattle off Judith Wright's A Sunburnt Country without even reading it. But that reflects who we are as a country, doesn't it? It joins us to landscape, it joins us to what Australia, when we close our eyes. I love a sunburnt country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooded rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jewel sea, her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. But I also say that there is more than this is more than symbolism. It is important because how we see ourselves is fundamental to reconciliation and the notion of truth-telling. If the only way Australia acknowledges First Australians as bad stereotypes in the media, then that's what people will see. But this opportunity of recognising First Peoples in continual referendum change and recognition will take the next step in that journey of reconciliation. But if we acknowledge First Australians as the traditional custodians of this land, the First Australians are obviously victims of great injustice, and that injustice is still felt today. That pain is our collective pain and our collective responsibilities as Australians to redress. That takes us some way towards the topic of what I've chosen to talk about tonight. In absolute closing, can I say that addressing the impacts of those injustices will bring First Australians just into what it should be in the centre of our thoughts as Australians. What does the reconciliation look like to me? It looks like that there is no division as we see now. It looks like to me that young Aboriginal people can have the same hopes and opportunities and the same experiences and dreams as any other Australian, and we are far from that. In 1997, at the Reconciliation Convention in Melbourne, Patrick Dodgen stood up in front of a very cross John Howard and said, "You cannot have reconciliation without social justice." It was an incredible, important thing today. Sir Alex Bahrain, who was the Deputy Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, said that there are 3 planks to reconciliation, and 2 of them I'll tell you about tonight: the plank of truth-telling and the plank of restitution. There is much to be said of our survival as the oldest existing culture on the earth and our values. how we value the land, how we value the environment, how we value community. As aspiring promoters of a prospective referendum, the onus will be on us to illustrate to the Australian people the connection between the dispossession and the slaughter and the removal, but also, of course, that connection with the beauty, the strength and the complexity of Aboriginal culture. The connection between these actions and gaps are, in fact, why we need another referendum change. History cannot be ignored, and in this room I know you do not know that. You do know that. But also that the dispossession, the removal from families, and the micromanagement I spoke about were the action decisions of governments, both left and right, and we must take that responsibility. The result of the complete absence of any of the control of self-determination on the part of First Australians. These are just some of the main battlegrounds on which this prospective referendum will be fought, in my opinion. But fight it we must. Like anything worth fighting for, it will not be easy. There will be a difficult campaign. But let us begin that conversation. I would like to end my remarks tonight before I take questions with an excerpt from another wonderful Queensland woman, Oodgeroo Noonuccal. And this poem to me says everything about why we're gathered in this hall this evening. And the poem is, of course, The Dawn at Hand. And as I said, and I think my favourite country and western singer, Emmylou Harris, if you haven't heard of her, you haven't lived. She said, time is an unforgiving friend, and I haven't been able to address the whole topic of agreement making, but I'm happy to do that. But let's finish up from Oodgeroo, and the reason I've chosen this is Oodgeroo was a 67er. She fought in that referendum. She served this country, and she was a great Queenslander. And she said this in The Dawn is at Hand. Dark brothers, first Australian race, soon you will take your rightful place in the brotherhood long waited for, fringe dwellers no more. Sore, sore the tears you shed, when hope seemed folly and justice dead. Was the long night weary? Look up, dark band, the dawn is at hand. Thank you.
It falls to me this evening to convey our thanks to our speaker. She has very generously offered to take questions, but a cocktail function awaits us. So if you would be happy to go there, then perhaps people can speak to you there and we can have refreshments over questions. I'd like to convey a very sincere thanks from the School of Political Science and International Studies, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences and the University of Queensland for your insights this evening, your personal story, the information about the apology and the 1967 referendum, and the precision of your insights about the way forward are particularly valuable. Thank you very much for your time this evening. We have a very small token of our appreciation for your time. I'd like to welcome you all now to join us for a cocktail reception in the Atrium of the Global Change Institute. You head out of the front doors, turn right. There are some student ambassadors waiting to guide you in the right direction, so please join us for further discussions and a cocktail evening. Thank you for coming.